One of the classic texts that always comes up when Christians discuss homosexuality is Leviticus 18:22. Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is an abomination. And there are a number of things for us to look at with this passage as we consider maybe the progressive reading of Scripture is reasonable. Maybe it's worth looking at, and maybe it's a faithful interpretation. So to start, let's look at the word for abomination. That's a Hebrew word, Toevah, Toevah, and it's used 112 times in the Old Testament. Only 3 of them are related to homosexuality, 2 here in Leviticus and once in 1 Kings. More times than that, it's used to describe lying. It's also used to describe shepherds being an abomination. It's also used to describe cross-dressing as an abomination. It's used to address pride or sacrificing the wrong kind of animal. 6 times it's used to describe sacrificing something that's not what God exactly wanted. Mostly it's used to talk about injustice or talk about sin in general. And so what we end up with is we see that this word abomination, or the English translation that ends up abomination, is overused when it comes to homosexuality. And it makes me wonder if perhaps there's kind of a cultural layer that's in play here, because we don't use that word for other sins. And why is that? So maybe there's something else going on, and we're going to return to that word abomination here in just a minute. But what I want to start with is thinking about how do we read Leviticus 18:22 in its context. Okay, so that's the first in question. And so let's think with me about all of it of Leviticus 18. It starts with a short intro of a few verses that basically say, don't defile yourself like Egypt, which is where they came from. And then it ends with a little kind of outro, like half a dozen verses at the end, where it says, now don't defile yourself like Canaan, the land you're going into. Okay, so that's the top and the bottom. And then what it does is it lists out 20 prohibitions. 20. All right, I've made a list of them. See if you can track the theme. You see what they're talking about? Don't have sex with your mother. Don't have sex with your sister-in-law. Don't have sex with your uncle's wife or your daughter-in-law or your stepsister. And it goes on and on and on. And it lists 19 times, don't have sex with, don't have sex with, don't have sex with. But there's one other verse that is so curious. And I'm guessing you saw it. Do you see that? Yeah, it says, don't give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molek. That's weird, right? I mean, there are literally 20 prohibitions. 19 of them are don't have sex. And then you have this one about not sacrificing your children to Molek. It's a bit of an odd thing. It should cause us to ask questions like, hey, I'm trying to understand the Bible. What does the Bible mean? What does it say? How do I do this? How do I interpret? Well, what's really interesting is that verse about Molek, sacrificing your children in Molek, is immediately adjacent to the verse about men sleeping with men. And the next time you look it up, interestingly enough, those two go together. It comes from 2 Kings chapter 23, where the people are dishonoring God by sacrificing their children to Molek and having sex with male shrine prostitutes. So here you've got this whole chapter about not having sex, and you have this one outlying verse about Molek, and it's tied completely to this other verse about men having sex with men, which was one of the ways that sex was often, homosexual sexual activity was how it happened in the ancient world, which was coercive sex. And that's not okay according to Scripture. What if that was what's going on here? No wonder Molek was tied to that. But there's even more as we think about this passage, because there's another issue in the passage. If you look at it, just a couple of verses beforehand, in don't have sex with, it says literally, do not have sex with women who are on their period. Don't do that. Don't have sex with women on their period. Now, that might strike you as a little odd, because you've probably never heard a sermon about not having sex with women on their period. But maybe you've heard plenty of times that men should not lie with men. And so we have to ask that question. Why do we teach one but not the other? It's in the same list. Nowhere in the New Testament does it say that, oh, you can now have sex with women on their period. In fact, in Ezekiel 22, it specifically lists having sex with women on their period as Toevah, an abomination. So apparently it's just as big of a deal. So you have to ask yourself, why do we teach one and not the other? And so many times I think it comes down to the fact that pastors like me, we typically try to avoid the things that we might struggle with or do, and we'd rather control the morality of others. We'd rather condemn others. And Jesus has a strong word about this. He teaches all the time about hypocrisy, a lot more than he talks about sexual sin. He talks about when those who are the teachers are teaching things that somehow give them an advantage, gives them an escape from anything difficult. Jesus says that is wrong. And so when you think about Leviticus 18:22, you've got to be thinking about Leviticus 18, verse 19, and say, yeah, do we really believe this stuff? Or is someone cherry picking, and what's the agenda? And then finally, just as we think about this stuff, we have to wrestle with what's the role of law in the believer's life. In Hebrews chapter 7 and chapter 8, the author is kind of just teaching us that the law is, and I quote, obsolete, that it's been replaced, that it's, quote unquote, useless. And so what is the role of the law in Leviticus anyway, when Jesus has so much teaching around what it means to love? And we'll look at that in another video, but you have to ask yourself the question, are we as Christians under the law? And if we're not, well, doesn't that negate the force of Leviticus 18, verse 22? So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about around the progressive reading of Scripture, and I wonder if that might be something to consider as a reasonable interpretation of this Bible passage. Thanks for listening.